Welcome to this edition of Diligence Inside America's Boardrooms. I'm TK Kerstetter, and I'll be your host for today's show. Today, we're going to be talking about, is your compensation committee planning for future events today? And joining me is our compensation expert to talk about this. Please welcome Bob Romanchek, who's a partner and senior consultant with Meridian Compensation Partners. Welcome, Bob.
Yes, well, thank you. Hello, TK.
When I look across the public company landscape and remember years ago, but not that many years ago, we had about 13,000 some public companies. It might even been higher than that. But when you look today, we got that same number has dropped to about 5,000. And this is due to mergers, operating failures, but probably one of the biggest reasons is private equity takeovers. And we all know that there is just billions of dollars in private equity these days looking for a good home.
Right.
And in the executive comp world, when that happens, that is an event. And an event means that things happen. So I am hearing more and more companies are sort of getting in a pickle over poorly short-term and long-term executive comp, particularly when there's a private equity event which takes that company private. So I'm going to ask you to help me identify sort of what we're talking about here in the way of problems and headaches. And if you would, let's start with what I suspect is the easier of the two, which would be the impact on short-term compensation.
Yes, DK, nicely set up, and you are exactly correct. The number of public companies out there has very dramatically decreased. And the difference, if you look back 20, 30 years ago, it was mostly big public companies making acquisitions of other public companies. And I'll talk about that more in a little bit. But with the change now that a great preponderance of the transaction, it's private equity. So a private company taking a public company private, that has completely different implications on the incentive programs. So you're right, the short-term incentive plan, it's a little more straightforward, but here's the issue, one provision that I recommend all companies think about putting in. What happens in the short year or the stub year when the company is bought out? And whether you're expecting a transaction or not, you're susceptible, particularly in these times of high volatility on the marketplace. So you need to really think about what type of protections in your annual incentive plan you have for executives. There's really three categories. For that short year or the year in flight where the transaction could close, what do you do with that stub year with your executive annual incentive plan? Some companies are completely silent. They have not provided for anything. That's a problem because your executives and the company then, you have no negotiating leverage in the PE buyout. So you want to provide some provision for that. In general, severance, you might not provide it because it's a one-off executive termination. Matter of fact, there's probably poor performance. You want flexibility, whether you're going to pay a pro rata bonus. And so there really are two different ways to do that. One, which was the prevalent practice, is to say you're going to get a pro rata bonus upon the change of control close based on actual performance to that point. Sounds logical, sounds fair. The problem with that is if it's private equity, and you are nowhere near the end of the year, let's say it happens in May, you close, you got a lot of months to the end of the year, and you may not be able to come to an agreement on what performance is until the fiscal or calendar year is over, and you've got to wait an awfully long time to be able to compute actual to get pro rata. That's problem one. Problem two, that transaction, the PE firm is going to load up every dollar of expense due to the transaction in that short stub year. Push it all forward for expensing purposes. And what does that mean? Everybody has an annual bonus plan that's based on earnings. Well, if you have an extraordinary amount of expenses pushed forward due to the M&A transaction itself, you're going to get pro rata of actual, or in other words, pro rata of nothing. So using actual, and there was a tax problem. Under 162M of the tax code, the $1 million deduction rules, to get a performance-based exception, so that was deductible, you had to use actual. That was driving the practice. That tax rule is completely gone now. It's been a couple of years. And so you really should be looking at your annual bonus plan and making that prorated bonus based on target, a non-discretionary amount that a buyer, PE firm can't really mess around with. They can't load up expenses. And target is a fair number. That's been determined prior to the year, a fair bonus opportunity for each executive. So if you get prorated of target, it's going to end up being fair. You might, in actuality, have gotten a higher or lower, but generally speaking, over the years, it's the most fair treatment, and it guarantees that you are going to get something that is reasonable if a transaction happens.
So if that's the easier of the two, I'm almost afraid to ask you about the long-term compensation, because that's bigger dollars, and it sounds like that could even get messier.
Yeah, absolutely. You think of this, long-term incentives is by far the biggest pay component of your top executives. I mean, the long-term incentives may well equal total cash compensation, bonus and long-term, short-term incentive opportunity for all of your top executives. So the long-term incentives, you really want to make sure that you've got those protected properly. And of course, because most of those are equity or stock-based, in a run-up going to an M&A transaction, there's going to be a lot of value probably in the long-term incentives. So think about this. As I mentioned earlier, in the past, it was public companies making transactions where there's stock to roll into. So if you are the target and a big public company is buying you, you can roll your shares, your stock options and SARs and performance shares and restricted stock into stock of the buying public company. Matter of fact, there's even a way to do that, a formula under the tax regulations for stock options, how you do that on a tax-free exchange method. Very common and typical approach back in the day. Now we have private companies, there's no stock to roll into. So what's the problem here? All of your long-term incentives, and there are only those three categories: appreciation only, stock options, SARs, full value shares, restricted stock units that just vest based on time, no performance, and then shares or cash that typically over a 3-year period, you earn those based on a pre-established financial performance goal or relative stock price performance. All three of those categories, they typically all three denoted in stock. If stock's no longer available and the buyer has no stock, what most companies now, the great prevalent practice, have provided, based largely on some of the pressure from proxy advisory firms, is what's known as a double trigger. So upon the change of the transaction, the close, that's the single trigger. The second trigger, the double, is if you're involuntarily or constructively terminated, typically within 24 months of the change of control, then you get cashed out. However, now with private buyer with no stock to roll into, at the transaction, if you don't get vested or paid out, you have nothing. And so if you've got a double trigger by itself, you now are forced to negotiate with the buyer of what's going to happen upon the close. So again, you've lost the leverage of negotiation to do something on a single trigger. And the theory here is we want to stay with double triggers. Again, great majority have moved to double triggers. However, you really need to have what I refer to as a savior clause. And that very simply says if the buyer cannot roll your shares forward because there are no shares to roll into, they're private, or if they don't want to roll forward, some companies, even public companies, want to end that incentive and get you in a new incentive program going forward. If they can't or won't, your plan should automatically go back and say, upon the change of control close, all your long-term incentives get cashed out. And of course, if you've got just time-based vested stock options or restricted stock, you could do that on a pro rata or 100% basis. It gets a little more complicated when you have performance shares, because not only now do you have kind of a time-based vesting, you've got an underlying financial or stock price goal that you've got to deal with as well. So there's a second element there to figure out how you're going to actually cash those out upon the change of control. But bottom line, because the characteristic of the buyer has changed so significantly from mostly public companies to mostly private companies, you really need to have the savior provision that does say you get cashed out upon a change of control if in fact you can't roll forward. Many companies do not have that right now. And again, that you lose the negotiating leverage by not having that in your programs.
Well, again, no surprise that private equity is as active as it is. And it's something that a compensation committee, like you mentioned, did not have to worry about years ago to near to the level that they do today, because we're seeing a lot more transactions. So, Bob, we just have a second left. Anything else that sort of comp committees should be aware of relative to the challenges of going private, particularly with private equity?
Yeah, TK, I will say when you're dealing with this M&A area with executive compensation, the short and long-term incentives are key because of all the value. Also, the third area actually becomes the first is treatment of the golden parachute excise tax. Some very significant and potentially complex issue there, because that tax 20% is levied on each individual executive, and each executive has a safe harbor based on prior 5-year pay. It gets rather complicated, but there's some techniques there like straddling a year end to increase your safe harbor, allocating severance as consideration for a non-compete, which is not deemed to be a parachute payment, so you can reduce it. Or some private equity firms literally will agree to maintain the employment of a top executive for at least a 12-month period, 1 year, to avoid not only paying severance so soon, but having that be a parachute payment and thus entirely eliminating or avoiding the excise tax. That's a really good topic for the next tape.
Well, Bob, I want to thank you for taking the time, and we hope that comp committees will save themselves a lot of hassle and sort of protect their senior executives. So again, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, TK. Appreciate it.
And that will conclude this edition of Diligence Inside America's Boardrooms. We hope you enjoyed the show. We'll be back again next week when we take another look at a critical topic that'll help you be a better board member or committee member. So we'll see you then.